Thank you all. Thank you so much for your patience as we start this webinar. Thank you for joining us. And we appreciate your time. I know it's early in some parts of the world. We're grateful for your time. And this webinar is really as part of an effort to educate and inform U.S. institutional investors on the continent, Africa, the economic outlook, market trends, and investment landscape, and to help you understand some of these trends and different dynamics as well. And we have great institutions that are going to partner with us today on this webinar. We have Mercer, and we have Max Miservy from Mercer. He's head of sustainable investment. And we've done, through USAID support, MEDA advisors have conducted 2 research in 2018 and 2021, assessing and studying what institutional investors are looking at on the continent and infrastructure investment and other alternative asset classes. And he will be talking about some of the findings of that research and the recent document and paper that Mercer has published. And we also have the World Bank. We have Sarah Al-Nashar from World Bank Egypt. She's the senior economist with the World Bank. And she will be taking us through some of Egypt's country-specific economic trends and some insights as well. As I mentioned earlier, this is part of a larger effort to educate U.S. institutional investors, consultants, managers, and expand their knowledge and understanding of the African economic landscape. And this effort has been supported by USAID and Prosper Africa since 2016. And MEDA Advisors, as a global advisory firm, has been supporting that effort since then, and working with various institutions such as NASP, various trade organizations, to help and support and educate the institutional investor community. And we've been able to successfully mobilize more than $1.5 billion into the continent and other emerging markets. And this effort has been an incredible journey for us to support the US government, for us to support the institutional investor community here in the US and on the continent as well. So thank you all for joining us. A lot of friends and colleagues and supporters on the line. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your time. I will go ahead and invite Max to give us more of a broader continent perspective on investment and economy in Africa. Thank you, Max.
Thanks, Yabzira. Just share my screen. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm calling in from California, actually. I'm typically based in Boston, so it's a little early for me out here on the West Coast, but nonetheless, we persevere, don't we? No, so thrilled to be with all of you today. As Yabzira said, I lead our sustainable investment team at Mercer in the Americas region. So it's based in Boston. I cover North America and Latin America, formally in my role, but for the past 5 years, I've been working with MEDA advisors with NASP, with USAID, more recently, Prosper Africa and other partners to, kind of help make the case for why institutional investors should consider, making specific allocations on the African continent, understanding, what are risk, tolerances, risk perceptions. Are there areas where risks may be, over perceived, let's say, or perhaps, overappreciated? And are there opportunities that investors may be missing along the way and not actually really taking an active role in, getting to know the continent and the various opportunities that different markets within those countries can present? So as Yabzira mentioned, we had the pleasure of working on 2 different papers with MEDA advisors and other partners. And, just to put in context a little bit about my role in the team that I'm on, the sustainable investment team at Mercer has been in existence as a dedicated practice since 2004. But we've been working on kind of sustainable investment, or what, ESG related topics, as is now called, for decades prior to that, whether it was helping, US financial institutions or institutional investors think about how to integrate considerations around, tobacco related issues or other, ethical, moral issues, South Africa free movement and, kind of movements to divest from companies doing business there in the 80s and other times. So we helped clients along these various journeys as an institutional consultant, but formalized our practice early on. And what I would just highlight here is that, you think about sustainability in the, kind of frequent context is that we're talking about sustainability in the sense of environmental sustainability. The reason we purposely rebranded ourselves from responsible investing to sustainable investing a couple of years ago is to really highlight actually that connection to the Sustainable Development Goals and having a broader frame of reference beyond simply just environmental concerns to social interactions, to how society operates, how questions of just and fair functioning of the economy, inclusive finance, other social issues around health and education and welfare. So it's really taking a broader frame, and it's in that context that we've done this work with MEDA over a couple of papers. We've done other work with development finance institutions, including the Inter-American Development Bank on sustainable infrastructure investment in Latin America previously. And so this is a common theme that we're trying to really get our hands around. What are the opportunities that institutions should be aware of that they may be overlooking presently? So that's a bit of the background there. Our team does have a long history of working in climate change as well. And I'd say that an increasing topic that we're looking at these days, and as with many institutions trying to think about, is just transition financing in particular, a topic I'll return to subsequently in this presentation. So just a really quick snapshot of the global kind of scale of our team. We have outposts across the world, as you might imagine, big hubs in London and in Australia and New Zealand as well. And then those of us in the Americas, 7 full-time staff here in the Americas region. And you might ask yourself, well, why is somebody working in the Americas, have any connection with Africa? And really the goal here is that we are aligned in our interests in many ways with the MEDA Advisors' mission to drive institutional investment capital from the US and other OECD markets towards the African continent, and really thinking about, again, uncovering those opportunities and understanding the risks, but putting them in appropriate context. So there is an alignment there. And I think that, again, that kind of moves to our kind of role as sustainable investment consultants. So the 2 papers we highlighted, the first on the left there in 2018 was released, and it was a really broad approach towards really understanding through interviews with key asset owners, global asset owners, from the US and Canada and Europe, really thinking about, if they have significant infrastructure allocations in their portfolios today in private markets infrastructure, have they considered making any specific allocations to any countries within Africa, either through fund vehicles or through potentially direct or co-investment opportunities? And really trying to understand what, if they've made those investments, what led them to make those investments, how has their experience been? And, do they intend to invest more to up their allocation, or are they going to, pivot towards other potential opportunities? So really trying to draw out those lessons learned along the way and to really share them with the broader institutional community in this publication. We also wanted to really dive into what were those risks. The average investor, typically just because of where global benchmarks are, the African continent plays a relatively small portion of the global equity, allocation, for example. And so there may be, an under allocation there, and particularly in private markets, where of course you're typically investing with a fund manager. You want to have, very specific investments in a very specific location, and context, rather than the more liquid equity markets. That obviously takes a level of conviction to make that allocation in the first place. So really trying to understand those motivations and what investors need to know. The second paper issued in 2021, and this time done also in partnership with Standard Bank Group, really is I would say a tome of a paper. It's about 80 pages long, very, very in-depth. Dan Bond is on call as well, I see, who was my key partner in pulling all this information together, and conducted a number of interviews with partners and participants in different transactions that actually occurred in different regions of the continent, different countries. And the focus there was really on broadening out to look at, again, how were these actual transactions, done? Who was involved? Was there blended finance or catalytic capital involved in those transactions, which seek to, de-risk or mitigate the risk related to those investments? How was that structured? Who were the partners in those blended finance transactions? So really trying to draw apart the different threads of again, the ways, those kind of developments came about, It looked at a broader opportunity set of some infrastructure, some real estate, and other educational facility transactions. So we'll cover those in a moment. But it was a very much broader look. And again, intended to serve as sort of a reference document to help any investor who's interested in kind of getting more insights into how things are actually done, to read through that and see some case studies of what was done. We also did cover the kind of macroeconomic context of the case for investing in Africa, provided by a political economist from Standard Bank Group. It's really in depth, covers the demography of Africa, the rapid uptake of technology, from cell phones enabling the kind of leapfrogging of landline telephone technologies, for example, and using that as an example of sort of technological leapfrogging that could occur in other areas of the economy, whether it's renewable energy technology or distributed energy to other potential technological uptake. So highlights a macro case, and also we did talk about the impact investment case for these investments as well in the context there. So some of the key challenges that we had, and thanks Abzira for highlighting in the chat the links to those publications on MEDA's website. Some of the challenges that we got through interviews with some of these investors were, yes, there's this broad high risk perception and limited availability of risk mitigation measures. So, the average, again, I was saying earlier, the average, investor, likely does not, global diversified institutional investor, public pension or what have you, typically does not have a specific, Africa allocation within its strategic asset allocation. And again, that's typically because you're adhering to a benchmark, you're trying to, manage to that benchmark, and the benchmarks themselves are, typically Africa makes up a small portion. So you have to make an active decision to diverge from that benchmark, to take on active risk. And obviously, again, that takes conviction. It takes going on journeys such as the ones that many of you on this call will be going on, a delegation trip to go to Egypt or to go to other regions of the continent, go visit a country, learn about the context, learn about partners there. And so that can help overcome some of the initial risk perception and give investors a much better sense of from the ground level perspective, what are the opportunities and what can we be looking at and what should we be thinking about differently. There are limited investment vehicles for institutional investors. You do have, of course, large global funds invested into these markets. From the infrastructure context, a number of specialized infrastructure managers, some of whom have very specific footprints on the continent and are specialists there. Others, of course, the very large GPs of the world who have global diversified portfolios or might have an emerging markets focus with some portion of that that is allocated towards African markets. But by and large, to access these markets, it's not always easy to do from an institutional perspective. And I'd say the other key piece, of course, is for many large institutions globally, you have a minimum ticket size threshold, and then you also have written into your governance documents. Typically, you can't occupy, let's say, more than 20 or 25% of the given fund's total committed capital. So there are challenges there for some of these funds that may not have the requisite size and scale needed to attract institutional capital. We have to figure out other mechanisms to access those vehicles. As noted here, gaps in financing, particularly on project preparation. And again, this is specifically in the infrastructure context. And, kind of thinking about tracking the development of an infrastructure project, through from, again, preparing the project through to, constructing it and developing it. And then, of course, potentially exiting that out to other capital market, providers. That is a challenge in finding the financing needed to jump over all those gaps in the process to push through one stage and get to the next for greenfield projects or for brownfield projects. So that can be a challenge, and the refinancing as well of operating projects in particular is in local capital markets can be a challenge. So there is an opportunity here for potentially institutional capital as it gets more embedded into the continent from internationally to potentially help facilitate more of that refinancing into these stable, operating assets, providing, cash flows and other attractive, return opportunities there, of course. And then finally, fragmented markets. So, leading to limited project pipelines in any one jurisdiction. So you might think of this in the sense that, highways may be built and constructed in one country, but they may not always extend to their neighboring countries. And so therefore, they or at least they're not done in a coordinated fashion between countries all the time. And so it means that the size and scale of the projects could be limited in that respect. And then, it can be harder to take a more regionalized approach to, constructing infrastructure, for example. So just to highlight that also can constrain pipeline development. And please do put any questions in the chat as we go. Just a quick look at some of the case studies that we looked at in the second report, the 2021 report, looked at a natural gas-fired power plant development in Nigeria on the Azura Ido IPP project, which had different ownership between different investors, including Actis, through their Energy 5 fund. And so again, interesting transaction of how one investment was made, updates were made to that plant, and then it was exited to another institution, and how that transaction got done and who was involved in that. The Jabi Lake Mall in Nigeria, one of the largest malls in Nigeria, the largest mall in Nigeria, development that had a number of different facets to it, and was also challenged, I think, with the onset of COVID-19, and the challenges for occupancy rates, and of course just people going to the mall and purchasing things, shifted the economics of it. So it was actually a live example while we were doing this report of some of the difficulties there. But again, how those were, at the time when the report was written, overcome to some extent. The renewable energy IPP program in South Africa is really, it's an interesting case study of a way that a government has facilitated shifting towards renewable energy development for its electricity system in South Africa, and working with the public, private sector to structure transactions and kind of open up tranches of transactions of solar and wind projects and other types of renewable projects for private investment, and doing so in a way that there's guaranteed, tariffs that go towards those projects, and really creates a clear, line of cash flows for developers to have some, clarity around the market and what those opportunities might be, and then of course what sort of investment and financial profiles they might have. So interesting program. It's been, halted and restarted a few times, but and I think given where things are with the South African electricity market these days, with load shedding continuing, it's I think there's certainly some calls to reopen that program, and it may be moving forward soon again. Acorn Student Housing in Kenya. This is an interesting student housing project that was developed as there's a clear need for students coming from outside of the city, for example, to find housing there. And this program, developed sustainable, kind of green buildings for those students, and then actually was able to finance part of the development of their programs through green bond issuance on in the London markets, the financial markets, actually. So an interesting way of accessing international capital in a way to help develop, supportive housing in this sense on the continent as well. So anyways, I could go through these. Climate Investor One is just another interesting infrastructure and project preparation, pipeline for focusing on moving projects through that development and construction program with different levels of financing along the way, provided in some blended capital transactions. So it's a way of accelerating the kind of development of renewable energy projects on the continent, but doing so in some pretty innovative structures. So we profiled that. And then a few additional developments that we thought investors might want to know about that are available for supportive ways to think about accessing blended finance or mitigating some currency-related risks on the continent through the currency exchange and others. But the final piece I would highlight here is a really interesting and important development that MEDA advisors and USAID and partners have been involved in, which is the launch of what we might call investment or investor consortiums of KEPFIC in Kenya, the Kenyan Pension Fund Investment Consortium, and the Asset Owners Forum of South Africa. Sorry, we should have spelled out those acronyms here on the slide. Apologies for that. But the KEPFIC is a consortium of local pension funds in Kenya that are seeking to pool capital together to co-invest into supportive infrastructure projects or other developments in private markets, and have recently kind of tendered a first initial foray into developing a highway system in Kenya collectively. And there's a few different pieces there. It helps spread due diligence costs over making investments over a number of different participating investors, potentially finding managers to work with, or if they're doing direct investing, perform due diligence on those deals. But furthermore, it can help provide an avenue for potential partnership with international investors to bring their capital in, and allow those individual smaller local investors to collectively kind of surmount those minimum ticket thresholds that international funds may require to access them. So again, multiple different ways of providing benefits there. And then the Asset Owners Forum was launched more recently, and is a project of BATSETA, which is the kind of pension trustees professional organization in South Africa. So they have a number of the largest, pension funds and other institutional investors in South Africa aligned, and recently announced, you can see it on MIDA's website actually, that they surpassed their goal of, I think it was around 40 to 50 million US invested in infrastructure since the launch. And in their first year, they actually invested $400 million US into infrastructure and other transactions in South Africa. So again, far exceeding their goal, and are actively working with local government to try to advocate for supportive policy mechanisms to help drive more investment into infrastructure in the country. So one to keep an eye on. So just a closing thoughts here and solutions. Some of the solutions that we identified through this work was certainly this education. Again, as mentioned earlier, taking a trip, going to see a specific country, meet with investors there, meet with local counterparts, see some projects that are under development or operating, and understanding the context that they were brought to life in is really the key piece, and building investor conviction around the thesis. You can read anywhere about the demography of Africa, that the United Nations predicts that by 2050 it's going to be driving the world's population growth for the next coming decades in comparison to virtually every other continent on the world. So with all that growth comes opportunities. There's certainly challenges, and so I think that it's one to keep an eye on. And I think that we should we believe at Mercer that it's important for investors to kind of begin to learn and see more. Leveraging partner relationships and resources. This is, if you're working with existing private market investor, fund managers, for example, understanding if they're global in nature, do they have any particular exposures there on the continent? You may have to look specifically at EM mandates and think about, what you can learn from them. Organizations such as MIDA certainly can provide great access. And then in addition, you could have the opportunities of potentially learning from and collaborating with some of the local counterparts from either Asset Owners Forum or KEPFIC or others that you may meet along your travels. Thinking about the alignment of interest here, part of the thesis for institutional or international institutions investing potentially alongside local investors is that there could be an element of mitigating some political risks that could otherwise occur if you have a long development cycle of a project. If it were just purely international capital, local regulators or local politicians, may or may not, have some, interest in kind of, trying to manipulate things, whether it's, unfair, challenges or taxes or pricing or what have you. That could be a challenge in any jurisdiction. But if you are partnered with local institutions where, local constituents, citizens have their pensions tied up with this pension fund who's also investing alongside you, that creates a really interesting sort of level of mitigating some of those considerations, and certainly helps to align interests and helps share knowledge, I would imagine, also between asset owners around what are others doing, and can you communicate with them as well. So those co-investing opportunities can also be sourced by your local partners as well, of course, and again, as noted, helps provide some risk mitigation in addition to political risk insurance or other trade finance insurance that one can also take a look at in the risk transfer space. So I think my time is up. I think I highlighted on the last slide just simply where you can find the Mercer publications, but of course, Mercer MIDA publication has to be clear, but Yabzir already put them in the chat, so I will yield back the floor and come back for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. Really appreciate it. You've taken us through the publications, the challenges, and case studies that are within the publication, and really tools and approaches to mitigate the challenges as well, and really appreciate that overall insight and a broader perspective as well. So thank you, Max. We'll definitely open up for Q&A. Please feel free to drop in your questions in the chat, and we'll have them answered by either Max or Sarah at the end of the presentation. And moving on now to our second part of the webinar. As Max mentioned, as part of building this ecosystem and providing the education exposure on African markets, Prosper Africa and USAID has been supporting investor delegation trips to various African countries since 2016. And that has taken us to West Africa, South Africa, East Africa, and now this year we are going to be in Egypt. This investor delegation trip will take place next month, and this is Prosper Africa's and USAID's effort to provide an on-the-ground exposure to really understand what these countries are, and to build relationships, to connect with viable managers who are investing on the continent, on the ground, and to really create that bond and build that bridge. So as part of that effort, we're working closely with partners, of course, USAID Mission and the embassy in Egypt, and our partner, the World Bank as well. And Sarah Al-Nashar, the senior economist of the World Bank in Egypt, will give us a brief overview on a country-specific economic outlook and investment landscape as well, and what the World Bank really does in Egypt. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome all. Thank you for your interest. It's a pleasure really to be with you today. Let me pull up my slides. Okay. Is it in full screen mode, right?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So, so the Egyptian economy has undergone since let's say 2014, or more specifically since 2016, several reform measures. So Egypt embarked on a macroeconomic stabilization and structural reform program, especially since 2016. These were coupled also with energy sector reforms that boosted the availability of the electricity and opened up the market for renewables. So this package of reforms since 2016 restored the confidence in the Egyptian economy and boosted investments and accelerated growth for the period that preceded the COVID crisis. And this, of course, followed a period before that, where there were political and economic developments that had really taken their toll on the economy. So the 2016 reform package really aimed at restoring macroeconomic stabilization, confidence, boosting infrastructure, and restoring the overall investor sentiment for the Egyptian economy. Now, these days, this year, the Egyptian economy is at a critical juncture, of course, because notwithstanding these very ambitious reform efforts that Egypt has undertaken, still there are still significant long-standing challenges. So most notably on the debt front, for example. Government debt at the end of the previous fiscal year was just above 88% of GDP. And thus the fiscal space is limited by the interest burden as well as the relatively low revenue mobilization. And this leaves, of course, limited amount of resources in order to be directed to social protection and human development. There are also underperforming foreign income activities, specifically non-oil exports and FDI. And then there is the sluggish performance of the private sector, especially when it comes to the formal private sector and its contribution in job creation. These pre-existing challenges intersected a year ago with severe concurrent global shocks, most notably the repercussions of the war in Ukraine, the high and volatile energy and food prices. Egypt is a net commodity importer, so It was a very big shock for the Egyptian economy. And this, of course, was coupled with the rapid monetary tightening, especially in advanced economies, which led to capital outflows from emerging markets and developing economies like Egypt. The combination of these concurrent global shocks with the pre-existing challenges has led to a foreign exchange crunch. So in the next slides, I will be presenting figures tracing the main economic indicators on the external accounts front, on its implications for inflation, its implications for the fiscal accounts, in order to gauge the impact of the recent shocks, as well as the performance, as well as the impact of also the policy adjustment that Egypt undertook. And then I will finally talk a little bit about the outlook, the medium-term outlook. So at the outset of the war in Ukraine, Egypt witnessed a large amount of capital outflows. So portfolio outflows were quite substantial in March 2022, so just above a year ago. And this led to a drop in the official reserves, as well as the other foreign currency assets held by the central bank. Since then, so the sharp drop that we see was mainly in March 2022. Since then, there has been an uptick slightly, gradually, in these foreign income reserves. Foreign reserves. However, they remain still well below their levels in prior to the March shocks. We also note that there have been pressures on external accounts even prior to the war in Ukraine. And this we can see through the net foreign assets position of the banking system, which has been declining even since the beginning of the past fiscal year, since July 2021. But the big shock, of course, came with the portfolio outflows that I mentioned at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. In response to these pressures, especially on external accounts, the Egyptian authorities undertook a package of reforms that involved monetary exchange rate as well as a fiscal package of reforms. On the exchange rate front, the central bank took the decision to allow for more flexibility in the exchange rate. So prior to March 2022, we had 2 years of nominal stability in the exchange rate, even through the turmoil that the COVID pandemic has caused. And this led to an ensuing real appreciation in the exchange rate and some loss of competitiveness. So the decision that was taken in March 2022 is to move to a more flexible exchange rate regime that reflects really market dynamics and removes any distortions in the foreign exchange market. So Egypt was one of the countries that undertook really a substantial, allowed the exchange rate to depreciate quite substantially so these are the figures showing Egypt compared to many other emerging markets, and showing that Egypt's exchange rate adjustment was higher than many other emerging markets. In tandem, the central bank also raised key policy rates successively. Cumulatively, the amount of increase is 1,000 basis points between March 2022 and April 2023. Together with this monetary exchange rate package, the government has also announced a series of social mitigation packages that involve expansion in the coverage of the Takaful and Karama packages, the cash transfer programs, and also an increase in the allocation and the amount that is allocated to the families. There was also hikes to the pensions as well as the public wages. There were some tax relief measures, and as well as changes in the threshold of the income tax and so on. So in terms of how these global shocks and the policy adjustment, what it meant for the people really, is that there has been a quite large inflation spike. So we can see from the figure on the left that core inflation has already surpassed the previous exchange rate episode, inflation episode back in 2017. Urban inflation has not reached the peak of the 2017 episode yet, but we believe that there are still inflationary pressures that are ongoing. This was mainly driven by the food and beverage component of the consumption basket. As we see from the right-hand side figure, the orange bars are the largest contributor to the headline inflation rate. This is quite critical because food inflation disproportionately affects the poorest households. So in terms of the composition of the consumption basket, about 44% of the budgets of the poorest households go to food. So that's why it is really critical. There was an attempt to, through the social mitigation packages that I have alluded to. Notably, there were also, I would like to add that there were top-ups to the food subsidy cards, which are very much, let's say, their coverage is quite large. Just under 70% of the population have access to these food ration cards, to the subsidy cards. So there was a top-up that also helped partially mitigate the impact of these very difficult conditions from the global shocks as well as from the policy adjustment. Poverty colleagues in the World Bank have run their micro simulations, and they show that the mitigation measures have helped reduce the spike or the uptick in the poverty rate. But of course, these are only simulations. The latest figures that we have are only for 2019. They come from, of course, CAPMAS, our National Statistics Office. While the inflation, this episode was mainly driven by these cost push factors, so a combination of depreciation, so anything that is imported is now much more costly in domestic currency terms. There is important inflation because globally international prices have been very volatile and increasing and very high. And there was also the domestic supply bottlenecks also that created some reduction in supply of certain goods and thus higher prices. So this was basically the bigger contributor to headline inflation. However, we also note that there may have been also some demand pull factors of inflation, and we capture this through the domestic credit that is extended in the economy, and we see, which is the line that is dotted across the figure, the top line that sort of frames the upper bound of the figure. The upper part of the figure shows the growth rate in domestic credits, and we see that it has been increasing, and the biggest driver has been credit extended to the government, understandably with the rising financing needs. This is a segue to really move on to the fiscal accounts. So Egypt has undertaken this very strong fiscal consolidation program. We can see that, so the full bar would be the expenditure to GDP ratio. And we see that there has been a big adjustment. So a very ambitious sort of containment of expenditures to GDP ratio between or let's say from fiscal year 2016 until fiscal year 2022. Nevertheless, fiscal space remains limited because interest payments, as I said at the beginning, takes up the largest portion of expenditures, and revenue mobilization is still below potential. That's why when we look at expenditures when we look at the breakdown of expenditures by functional classification, we see that there has been some improvement in the non-oil subsidy or non-energy subsidy social protection measures, which is the first stack of bars. However, sectors like health and education continue to suffer limited allocations in the budget. Especially when we look at them in real terms. So they have been increased, of course, in nominal terms, but when looking at them in real terms or as a percent of GDP, we see that there is still room for increasing allocations to these very important sectors. Finally, I will provide some reflections on the outlook. So given the spike in inflation, it's eroding, of course, real incomes. So affecting the purchasing power and the demand of consumers or households are affected. So that's on the demand side. On the supply side, firms' activity, the leading indicators are showing that firms' activity are constrained by the higher costs and the supply bottlenecks. And so we are projecting a downtick in growth in the current fiscal year, in FY23. Going forward, we expect a gradual increase in growth, supported by the exchange rate depreciation, which should restore the competitiveness of the Egyptian economy. Egypt has entered an IMF program. It was approved last December, the Extended Fund Facility. So this should provide some mitigation because under these very difficult global context and tightening financial markets, access to credit is expected to be constrained for Egypt in the current fiscal year. However, the international financing, as well as potential asset sales, as part of the IMF program and the fund and the financing that the IMF program can also unlock from bilateral and other multilateral institutions, should provide some relief to the balance of payments pressures. On the fiscal front, the social mitigation package that I had mentioned, as well as the higher interest rates from the monetary tightening and generally the higher prices that the government is facing, altogether are putting pressure on the budget this current fiscal year and probably the coming one as well, FY24. So we expect an uptick in the deficit to GDP ratio. I believe this will be the first time for the deficit to increase in many, many years. However, under the baseline scenario, as Egypt continues to push ahead with the fiscal consolidation, as well as the structural reform measures, this should bring down the deficit to GDP ratio. And so this can also have a favorable effect on the debt because the government debt is expected to increase again this fiscal year because not only of the fiscal pressures, but there is the depreciation valuation effect. But with the resumption of fiscal consolidation, addressing of any lingering distortions in the foreign exchange market, macro stability is expected to be restored under that baseline scenario. Of course, there are risks to this scenario, but as long as there is that commitment to the macro stabilization, as well as the key reforms that can open up the economy for more private sector activity, then we can expect a restoration of a more, let's say, sustainable and more resilient path. That's all from my side, and happy to take any questions. I will also write in the comments, I will provide the links to the latest World Bank reports. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sarah. We really appreciate this overview on Egypt. I'm sure most of us have been reading the headlines in the news, and it always is helpful to get specific data and information from the experts, and to get a better understanding than just a sensational news that we see in the media. So thank you. We really appreciate this for your insights and for your very great update. So if you participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat. There was one question for Max, and I'll read it out. Can you share about recent post-COVID examples of where U.S. institutions have invested in Africa? What were the criteria that helped to realize this capital infusion happening?
Great. Yeah. No, great question. So I mean, I think I'm pretty sure, and this is an area where I think that it can be challenging to always gather the right information, on this, because of course, private capital transactions aren't always made public. But I believe, and maybe Zara, you might have better insights into this, but I believe that some U.S. institutions also participated in the transaction with the Asset Owners Forum in South Africa, the DPI. I don't know if I'm supposed to use a name, but anyways, but there's a transaction that's on your website. So yeah, just to highlight the fact that I think that there was participation from some U.S. asset owners there in an investment with the fund manager, DPI, or Development Partners International. And so I think that that's one. I don't know if, again, from the META side, that if either any of you might be able to share some more details about that, yep. What led to that, because I was not personally involved there, but I know that that's just one recent one that I am aware of. So. Yeah,
sure. I can just add a little bit of color on that, and I'm sure you can speak to the criteria, right? What U.S. institutional investors are really looking for right now that is attractive for them to make an allocation. But in terms of that specific transaction, there was a co-investment between U.S. and African institutional investors. And investing in a fund that is investing across the continent. This investment was in 2019, right when the pandemic hit, but that was an effort of several of these engagements and activities that we've done to cultivate the relationships, to educate investors. So there was U.S. institutional investors participating in this fund, Kenyan pension funds, and also South African pension funds that participated in this Pan-African fund. So that has been in 2019 and also definitely part of the ongoing effort since a few years back.
Right, and Zara, I'm reminded also, might be the early hours, so sorry, my brain's a little foggy, but I know that there has been increased activity from U.S. institutions into venture capital funds, for example, as well. You'll see. Just reading industry news, about TechCrunch, for example, will oftentimes feature, VC funds raising Fund 1 and with a focus on Africa or at least some exposure there, highlighting different fundraising amounts that they've come across. So I'd say that space actually has been interesting. And obviously, yes, there's challenging headwinds in the VC space as well these days. Not to overlook that, but I would say that's one area where I know that venture capital reached a record amount on the continent last year. I think it was $4 billion US in total that was, I think, invested in 2022 in VC. Again, we'll see what happens going forward, if that outlook will shift or not, or if there will be some diversification effect to that compared to other venture capital markets. So just one other area to highlight there.
Thank you, Max. And the VC space actually in Egypt is incredible, and it's been growing the past few years, and it has gotten to the level where some of these companies are being evaluated an increased amount of dollars, and they're doing pretty well. Since the banking sector is limited in banking, the unbanked community, people in the informal economy, and so on, and is thriving and it's doing great. And just going into maybe a question towards Sarah, if you can highlight the key industries that are pivotal for Egypt's development and sustainable growth, maybe if you can highlight some of them there as well.
Thanks a lot. So, Egypt has published its national structural reform program, and it outlines the main constraints towards moving to higher productivity and export-oriented sectors in order to put really the Egyptian economy on a higher and more sustainable growth path. Egypt has a lot of potential in renewables, given the weather conditions and the location and geography, and also this is a sector that has a lot of potential, and I believe that the legislative reforms that took place in recent years have also opened up the market really for private sector investment there. Other sectors are the agribusiness sectors that are, of course, Egypt has a very large agriculture sector that continues to be around 11% of GDP or more. And linking this very vital sector to manufacturing is an area where that can be potentially very beneficial because it can lift a lot of people from poverty, and it has a lot of potential given Egypt's already large agricultural produce. So manufacturing that is related to farm activities and to agribusiness generally is also a big potential. ICT has been already growing at double digits for many years. It has been, even though its portion in the economy continues to be relatively small. However, it has increased incrementally as it has been growing, and there is a lot of potential in ICT as the country also develops its not only digital infrastructure but upgrading of public delivery service. So this is a big drive that can pull in and can crowd in private investments and manufacturing. So textiles have historically been a very important part of the industry in Egypt, and there is the infrastructure, there is the know-how, there are links already with Europe and the US in terms of exports, but larger integration, bigger integration in global value chains in the textile sector or other light manufacturing can also looks like a good potential for Egypt to grow in a more sustainable way.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's very insightful. And then for our delegates who will be part of the Egypt delegation trip, I think this is a great information for you to have prior to getting there. And we will interact with the World Bank and other institutions as well, so you can have better understanding, conversations, and exchange with the experts on the ground as well to have better understanding. And for everyone else who are interested in the broader continental market, looking to see where it makes sense for their institution to allocate and in their journey to consider allocating, where we will continue to provide you and to be support of research, data, and statistics that can be helpful. And I think everyone kind of agrees by this time and day and age that the continent is definitely the right place to be. Its growth and economic development it has great projections, and there's a lot of potential to generate very attractive returns as investors in different institutions. And right now it's a matter of showing the right numbers, the right statistics and data, and building the right partnerships and relationships on the ground to make the investments happen. So we're grateful for our partners. We're grateful for our supporters, Prosper Africa, USAID, for making this journey possible. And we rely on partners like Mercer and the World Bank to equip you with the right information and data. So we're grateful for everyone. And we thank you for being part of this webinar. The recording will be available. We'll share with everyone who registered, and also the information that was shared in the chat, the research, the document, and the data. we'll share that with you. And if you have any questions after that, we'll get in touch with Max and Sarah to get them answered for you. I think this is it. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a wonderful day and evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And for our panelists, thank you, Max and Sarah. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.